But I'll get into my section. I basically say Heather's is a nice reminder that it's never really been a good time to be a teenager. It's never been fun. No one's ever been like, I love being a teenager. Greatest time ever.
I imagine Heather Chandler would say that.
Maybe, yeah.
Those who
Well,
peak
no,
in high
she
school.
had some like struggles too, or like she was not treated well by men. But
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like she was deeply insecure, and that's why she was so mean. But it's okay. That's my own like psychoanalysis of her. But apparently, teens are perpetually misunderstood and made out to be monsters. And in watching this for the first time, and after Talk to Me, it was a little hard to compare the two. As they're just such different vibes for approaching a similar message.
Yeah.
It was just a very drastic contrast where I was like, wow, this is very different.
Look at how we grew as a society.
Yeah, there's like, as you said, it's like very like it's like making it feel lighter than it is. Like it's like a sad time. So yeah, Heather's like made like haha, and it's not a haha topic. So yeah, I don't know. I totally get the critique of society's manipulation of tragedy to serve or feed a narrative that happens all the time, and it's gross. And also how teens are generally misunderstood and not supported during the years when they need the most support. Like I remember hearing my mom described something similar that when she turned 14, like her entire relationship with her parents changed, where they just like treated her like an adult and like stopped taking care of her emotionally.
Yeah, I hate adults who do that. They're like, you're 18, get out of the house.
It's gross. Like you don't just get to stop being a parent now. So like it's just like, yeah, it's like a thing. She's technically in the generation of Heather's, like she would have been a teenager when this was being filmed. So it's just like, yeah, I think she probably would watch this and relate pretty heavily. So the 80s and mental health, teen suicide, unfortunately, drastically increased between 1950 and 1990, which is largely why a film like Heather's was made when it was, as well as all the other ones that are commenting on it. The peak of suicide rates for teens specifically took place between 1970 and 1980, and then capped in the 90s. So if this came out in like 1986, it was right, or 88, I'm sorry. It was like right at where this capped. But yeah, so from that point on, it declined. And the largest contributors to increased suicide rates are multifaceted, like anything in America. The why is complicated and drenched in capitalism, racism, and misogyny. Essentially, during this time, there's a lot of social change that the government didn't want to happen. So they didn't give you any support in that transition period. This change was not accepted by systems in play. And there's also like a lot of other factors. Like the government was not about to start funding social supports to actually help people. Because under capitalism and in a racist, misogynist system, we can't be supporting families. This is like Reaganomics. Like it's happening right then. You know, as I said, they were winding up to Reagan. So when any support that did exist, by the time Heather's came out, I was like getting gutted, you know? So a big proponent of, or at least my theories, and based on like some of the research that I did, it kind of does seem like that the period between like the 70s and 80s was a big deal because women were entering the workforce more consistently, but without any like social supports needed to enact that safely. Like they were like, you know what, we're not going to give you any daycare. We're not going to give you any supports with that. We're not going to tell men that like they need to help contribute to the family structure. We're not going to give you anything that will make working easier or like safe for your kids.
So it's a penalty if you choose work over family.
Yeah, and it was like demonized in a lot of ways. So many white men did not appreciate this change in dynamic, and that largely benefited them. Essentially, when women more actively entered the workforce, misogynistic policies were put into place to discourage their success. Maternity leave and protections for women workers were not supported, and wage gaps were pretty large. Also, divorce was becoming more acceptable. So men were now not allowed to be left for treating their wives and families poorly. Which a lot did. They all left. A lot of people left. There's a lot of divorce during this time because they finally could.
Yeah.
Without like mass social assassination, you know, like some it's still like frowned upon.
Financial.
Yeah. You could have credit cards and get abortions. It was a big deal. So like a lot of women left their husbands and the misogyny ingrained into social structures made conflicts between men and women even more prevalent. And this is relevant to Heather's because what we see is like the parents like clearly don't like each other. They don't even talk. Like they're together. They don't talk to the kid either. And that's like a big proponent of that is because a lot during this time, there's a shift, as I said, like to both men and women working, at least in some households, not in like the wealthy ones where they didn't have to, but like this made it so there was less availability mentally for both parents to be present for the children. So essentially, increased divorce rates, etc., and then more single moms as a result of that. And even when both households and single people, the ones that did stay together were stretched thin when it came to capacity of supporting their kids because there wasn't any kind of like structure in place to support them other than school. Mm-hmm. And as a result of these combined factors, school became more heavily relied on to raise children. But school was not equipped for this. As you can see, all the teachers in that school, except for maybe one, but like she like performatively cared. They did not care about those kids at all. And there was not enough of them to adequately support them.
To care.
Yeah. And like they were just not equipped for this. And during Reagan's presidency, he cut like an insane amount of money from education. So they were also just like gutted financially. While given this like really big responsibility essentially of raising an entire generation of kids because the parents just didn't have time. So they were not equipped. There was not training. They didn't have like mental health first aid or like trauma-informed care or even any kind of like mental health training. It was like teach them how to be factory workers and call it a day. But they didn't have their parents at home, so they needed parental guidance and figures. And during this time, that was just like the parents were very hands off. That was like a transition socially that like parents like were very much like, you do your thing, friend. I'll see you when you're a grown up, I guess.
Well, that was like the latchkey era too. So for young kids, it was like you just go out, you come in when the street lights go on, and that's why there was like so many children abductions because the kids would just get into cars with people because they're just out on their bike talking to strangers. Like, nobody cared, nobody was home.
Yeah, and because of this, like the teachers, unfortunately, just like I'm sure there were some, but like they were not able to be authentically supporting all the students in the very unique ways they needed to be. And the goal of schools before this, as I said, was to keep kids busy and prepare them for future factory jobs to eventually become workers, not to support their emotional well-being and self-actualization as human beings. And the economic stress of this climate, the lack of therapy and the absence of governmental supports, in fact, like the gutting of governmental supports for these changes increased home stresses. And this is why during this time, there were the commercials in 1975 that ran on television reminding parents to hug their kids because they're people. I had to remind them that their kids were people.
And to care about them. And remember they're there.
Yeah, PSA. And it was like a big thing. So
drink milk and hug your kids.
So like it had to be a widespread, like the suicide rates were crazy, and I'm going to get into that, but like they were super high, and it makes sense considering all those factors. And there were additional contributing factors that increased these rates that are theorized, including in-home guns. There was significantly more guns readily available. Gas ovens, that was like the 1950s suicide spike, was that people could just stick their heads in ovens and be gone. It's more like if you don't have adequate time to think about the decision, because it's like an impulse thing a lot of the time. Like if you sit with it long enough, you might not do it. But if you're given a quicker option, you're more likely to be like, okay, I don't have to think about this more than a few minutes and I can just go. So the increase of guns, the shifts in control placed on teens to conform to societal norms, with schools being their only real place for guidance. The problems with schools were like exacerbated because they didn't have emotional support at home. So the school was like their primary guidance for how to be a person. And I don't know if you remember school, but it didn't do a good job. Even still now, for me, like I had a very bad time in school. I had some really kind teachers, absolutely. But like, if that was like the only thing that was available, I would not have made it. And there was also a lot of hatred and bullying towards anyone deemed different. Like it was very much like push the pegs down.
Yeah,
kind
hammer
of thing.
The nail. That sticks
hammer
out.
the nail, exactly. So for sexuality, gender, race, neurodivergence, etc., like all these things were demonized, and if you didn't fit into the factory worker peg, you were hammered down, essentially.
Yeah,
and
there's so many harmful words. Like language was so harmful in that time period. Like it was weaponized just for being kind of different. And then, language hurt.
Yeah, and there was like a lot of like just like they would just like torture kids for like just being themselves, to the point where like no one could be themselves, and that's why everyone was really sad. So because of these things, during the 1970s and 80s, over 49,496 youth aged 15 to 24 committed suicide, which comes from the surveillance summary of youth suicide in the United States from 1970 to 1980 from the CDC. And they continue saying the suicide rate for this age group increased 40%, from 8.8 deaths per 100,000 population in 1970 to 12.3 per 100,000 in 1980. While the rate for the remainder of the population remained stable, young adults, specifically 20 to 24, had approximately twice the number and rate of suicides as teenagers, and between 15 and 19 years old. The Western United States specifically had consistently higher youth suicide rates from 1970 to 1980 than any other of the three regions, North Central, Northeastern, and Southern. However, the difference in rates had narrowed substantially by 1980 because rates for each of the other regions also increased. So they eventually equaled out over this period. And the method of suicide changed significantly from 70s to the 80s. The proportion of suicides committed from firearms increased for both young males and females. And the proportion of both male and females committing suicide by poisoning declined. So people used to take a lot of pills or poisons, and then they stopped doing that because guns became available. Yeah. It didn't stop. Like, it was still like 28%, I think. It was still like a pretty high percentage. But just gun usage was higher.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
guns
like, you
and hanging were the two highest.
Well, it's like one of those you could, like, with poisoning, like, they can pump your stomach. You have a higher rate of, like, surviving that.
Yeah. Where a gun, no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, essentially, those introductions more heavily into society, and like handguns, like more compact weaponry, also contributed to this. So essentially the changes were more marked among females, who in the past had most commonly committed suicide through poisoning. They also started to transition into gun usage. Data show that among persons 15 to 24 years of age, young white male adults 2024 had the highest suicide risk specifically. So honestly, JD and ending how he did makes sense in the context of this information. Yeah. There's also research from the National Library of Medicine that examines the data of different age groups and suicide between 1970 to 2002. And the research analyzed the contextual factors that could influence increased suicide rates, such as economy, social supports, drug and alcohol availability, and more, suggesting that to improve economic stability and growth opportunities would likely decrease the risk of suicide in teens and adults, essentially linking back to what I said last week, that having supports and social systems in place that actually support people and their needs decreases the chances that someone will come to the conclusion that they are a burden and don't want to be here anymore. We should take care of each other, ultimately. Scientifically. And with our youth dealing with a somewhat hopeless future, rates like these seen in the late 1980s could rise again as the economic burden of a failing economy, a dying planet, and a dystopian future discourage people from wanting to be here. The data from recent years is showing a rise, not specifically with youth, but you know how the number that I said for the whole entire period of 1970 to 1980, almost that many people died alone in 2021.
Jeez. 2021, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah. And they came to this conclusion because of the drop of rates during the economic upturn of the 90s, essentially, when things got financially more secure and a future seemed a little more hopeful. A lot of less people took things into their own hands. So when unemployment and the economy was stable, it just didn't seem like as much of an option. So young people had job job opportunities on the horizon and hope for the future. So if we want the world to seem less hopeless, we need to fix a lot of things. And the next part of my section is the Heather Hydra and starting to pick up on a systemic oppression. So what was really interesting about this film for me was that it made progress towards recognizing the impacts of systemic oppression, but without like quite getting there because it was the 80s. Very close to the point, but likely because of the time it was released, just didn't take the next step. And like, as you say, like it does feel like pretty insensitively. And what I mean by this is there are so many calls out of society and how it impacts youth, as well as how participating in the system successfully requires burying others as well as your true self. Stepping on the roses. Many of the characters are just performances of people who actively step on others to get ahead. Being popular is done the same way one would succeed in society within capitalism. Stepping on others and making others feel like they need to conform or fall in line. Like if you think of any middle manager and a corporate company. And in the death of Heather and the rise of other Heather, Veronica starts to point that the replacing of the Hydra heads, like the Heathers replacing each other, is something that will keep happening within the social structure. Like something needs to change within the social structure. And that's like recognizing that it's not an individual issue, it's a systemic issue, but without like actually saying that or letting it end with that in mind.
Yeah.
So like it was like, oh, we kind of see it, but they just went right over it.
Yeah, she took it. She took the scrunchie.
Yeah. So in the death of Heather and the rise of other Heather, Veronica starts to point that replacing the heads of the Hydra is something that will keep happening, that to eliminate one threat, you were just making space for another, like a power vacuum. And what this film misses in some ways is that they only do the first step of what would be necessary to actually changing problems, which is that Veronica stops being a passive and begrudging participant in the like cruelty that she's witnessing and starts actively contributing to her ecosystem. First, she murders some people, but then, you know, starts to be like, oh, maybe we be kind to each other and I'm going to take that on. But some of this is done through murder, as I said, but it's not until the end that she starts to realize she can stand up and say she's not going to do these things anymore. And the issue here is mostly that she seizes power from within the system, which is such like the demographic thing to do. Becoming a player in it, but changing what is considered acceptable to be more inclusive of difference. Well, like not really, like you can only do so much change within the system.
Yeah. And also like what's going to happen to Heather? And why do you think they're going to listen to you and not Heather?
Yeah. It's a very idealistic approach from such a nihilistic film. And they treat it kind of like how you would expect a teenager to, in that they're still looking at it on a very individual level, keeping the onus on themselves to make the change and not really calling attention to the root or cause. But again, these are teenagers, so I'm not exactly expecting them to have the answers. It's more like the adults who are writing the scripts. But it's fine. Also, I'll say, as unhinged and problematic as Jason Dean was, and I'm sure that was the point, he did in many ways call out real flaws within society, much like the comic book supervillains. Every evil character generally thinks they're doing the right thing and do have some points, you know, fulfilling some kind of necessary purpose. And like, also, it's like they're a response to a societal need. You can't like just reject an entire group of people who's like, I'm struggling. And you can't be like, oh, they just need to go die. It's not the solution. We have to figure out a way to like help each other. And sometimes people get in the way of their own help. I get that. But like, I don't know. It's like he's a super villain in that he's a little too unhinged and it's not really relatable. But he did have a few points where I'm like, all right, I see what you're trying to do. You didn't do that at all. But I see what you were saying.
You said it with your mouth.
Yeah, you said it with your mouth. You did not say it with your actions at all. But you said it with your mouth. And
points.
Yeah, like kind of. And yeah, so I get it though, because each character is supposed to be this dramatized representation of a person and not an actual person. So like he had to be that extra, you know. But he makes valid points about how school is just a practice version of society, as Gabe got into, and that to do well in school, it operates just like you would in a job. And that was like so much the point of this film. So to be popular, you have to participate in a system that rewards cruel behavior. You have to be Heather or the boys.
Or Heather.
Ram. Or Heather. Or Heather, yeah. Well, one of the Heathers was nice. She actually had some like emotional depth there.
Yeah. Poor Heather.
Yeah.
If everyone jumped off a bridge, would you? And she was like, probably.
Yeah. No, she's sweet. And the issue with him mostly was that he did not have empathy, and that was like my main qualm with like a lot of the film.
Yeah.
And I think it was on purpose, like I get it, but also it was like there is no empathy like from the adults, from the kids to each other. Even once Veronica gets it, like she didn't view JD with empathy. She didn't view any of the other Heathers with empathy. She didn't like, you know, like you had to earn her kindness kind of. And she didn't have empathy for the people she actually did genuinely harm. So
yeah, she never like actually feels bad.
Yeah, and like she murdered some people. Like they were a problem, but murder.
But she shot that boy.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what I'm saying. This film like lacked a lot of empathy, and that brings me to the line of the film that I think accurately sums up society during this time, which Gabe invoked it as well. I'm going to invoke the same quote that Gabe mentioned above, where Veronica states, "I just want to be treated like a human being," and her mom's like, "What do you mean you are?" And I interpreted this that the issue is not that they're noticing. The issue is that they are noticing inequities in how humans are treated and want that to be different, want it to be fair and just. But the mother point, in my opinion, is that we don't treat human beings fairly in a capitalistic system. So the problems that Veronica thinks being treated like a human being should be different. It's like that's the issue, is that she's not conforming, that she's not, the peg isn't getting hammered down. Like, it's like, how dare you tell me like we need to be different? And essentially, that society doesn't treat humans fairly, empathetically, and with any care for their individuality or authentic selves, because it's a system. As I said, it gets so close. So she got the point without fully getting the point, that to do well in society that prioritizes wealth and exploitation, being treated like a human being sucks. And like the characters in the film are calling out the flaws of society and the control hypocrisy of society, and are met with adults that basically say, that's how it's always been. What do you want me to do about it? Yeah. And that's how like, I was treated. Anyone relate to the frustration of hearing that when presenting someone with valid concerns? Yep.
How many hands can I put up?
Yeah. And the adults in the film are the same as the high schoolers, as you say, Gabe. I think the fact that for much of the film, Veronica is just an unenthusiastic participant in the cruelty of her peers, kind of acting like the adults in her life who just take things for what they are, is like on purpose, obviously. And the shift away from just dealing with the atrocities of the world as a passive participant is also important. Like, she shifts away from that and starts to take a hands-on role. I just wish she went further. That's all. Also, one thing that I really disagree with in this film is that they suggest teenagers are without depth. And it's like one of my pillars. I realize, like, one of the things I'm like very passionate about is like, I'm like, empathy is so important. It's so hard, and you need to have it, and like, you need to really focus in. So if you're saying someone doesn't have depth, you're like removing your empathy, and it like upsets me. So misunderstanding their actions and the reasons for doing things, absolutely, they do that. But I don't think that means teens are without depth. I think, as you said, Gabe, it's like they're not movie depth. Like, they're just people depth. But like, I think every human is unique and has a whole spectrum of experiences and emotions and motivations for their actions. Understanding that everyone has their own lives and frustrations and motivations is a large part of empathy and like being kind to others. It's like, maybe that wasn't about me. Maybe they're just having a really hard day. And most of the time that is true. Usually when people are jerks, it usually doesn't have much to do with you, and more to do with the fact that of all of the things that they've experienced their whole life and how they don't know how to process that and are taking it out on the people around them. So I just feel like it's a large part of empathy, which is something the film lacked. And there are absolutely exceptions to that rule, and that there are people who are just so detached from themselves that their sense of why that they don't, and their sense of why that they don't have the capacity to authentically express that to others. Like, there are people who don't see their own depths, and because of that, like, just are harmful. or also people who seek validation from the same systems that harm them and then perpetuate that harm. So like if those people did not exist, we would not have a system in the first place. Like obviously they have to exist. But I'm just saying, like, if those people did not exist, we would not have a system in the first place. So I think there's a problem with the perpetuators of the system and harm. And in the grand scheme of things, their intent doesn't matter more than their impact of harm. So it's like, I'm not saying excuse them, but I'm just saying we need to like recognize we can't remove their depth entirely, because then you're also kind of removing their ability to change or be held accountable to their actions. And I think it's more accurate that society deeply misunderstands its youth, prioritizing them as workers and how they can contribute to those in power rather than focusing on them as people. Heather, Kurt, and Ram were problems, absolutely, and the harm they perpetuated matters much more than their why. I'm not saying that, but to dehumanize them in removing their humanity and their capacity for empathy, we are basically saying that the only solution for the Heathers, Kurts, and Rams of the world is to kill them. And for some of them, maybe that's true, but also I feel like that's like a real effed up perspective. Yeah. I don't know. Like, I get it sometimes. And then also I'm like, but if they're without depth, they're without redemption. And I just feel like if we're going to have a restorative justice based society that like gives people a chance to grow and change, if we don't want like Gen Z's problem that they have, like where they can't fail gracefully, like they can't fail ever and they have to like always be correct and right, like it just really limits growth. And there's some people who are unredeemable, absolutely, but like I don't know if Heather was unredeemable. Like, honestly, like, Ram and Kurt did some effed up things, but I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like if we're removing their depth and, like, ability to grow as people, we're removing their opportunity for redemption. And, like, maybe they need to they need to be shut down for a while and then come back when they're older and they've learned their lesson and whatever. But, like, there's no pulling them back in that understanding of the world. Like, if we feel that way, we might as well just be Jason Dean, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
like they should have, like, these people should have had consequences for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's just, I don't think death was the consequence. And then rewriting them, because now they don't have consequence. No. They get now, like, Kurt and Ram have sympathy.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like, yeah, it's a whole thing. And it's like, yeah, it's like if we want a restorative justice-based thing, we have to give that to kids. Like, these are kids is more so where I'm at. Like, it's like they were very flawed kids who deserve consequences. But as you said, maybe not death. Because if you're a kid, you have eventually the chance, hopefully. I mean, hopefully everyone can eventually have the chance, depending on where you are at in your stage of life. But, like, the chance to be better tomorrow. You know, and if you're like removing that person's ability to do that, that sucks.
Yeah. And it's like, yeah, they're a product of their environment. Like, it's very clear, like, they were mimicking what was said. It's all these kids seem to understand that they were just the next round of the same people. And it was Veronica who was like, I don't want to be the next round of the same people. But at the same time, I am benefiting from the same round of the same people. I just know something is up. Like, yeah. So like you were saying, it didn't quite get there because she's still, like, I don't think she really fully understood it. And she wasn't an incredibly sympathetic character. I don't think she was supposed to be. Like, she's obviously very flawed too. But yeah, I think because of that, like, I have a hard time when there's no redeemable character or no character that I can really truly root for. And I never really felt like rooting for Veronica. I was like, girl, like, if you're supposed to be so deep, you know, like, then why aren't you catching this? Like, why are you, like, you know?
And the characters I would have rooted for are like so far in the background, you know?
Yeah. And I just genuinely think that this is a film that was made for a different audience than myself. And I respect that exists. And I think, you know, in expanding and unpacking it, and also like hearing, you know, your section count, I do feel like I understand it better. And like, I'm glad it exists, you know, for saying what it did. It makes me similarly sad to the fact that, like, that time existed and that those people felt that way. And that they still feel this way, right? Like, you know, like, it kind of makes me sad because it does a really good job of reflecting what was really happening and what the real problems were of that time, in a way that those other films and documentaries and what have you were not doing. Like, I think it in being a Black comedy and making fun of it and being just so over the top, I felt like it was more honest than a lot of other films of that time. For that reason, fair, it just still sucks, and it was still a product of that time when people said awful, gross things. And again, I get, like, you're comedy
wasn't really funny. Yeah,
it wasn't funny to me. It was like, what are we doing? It's like, ew. Yeah. But again, I get it, and I think, like, if you try to remove that from the film, then it's not this film. You're making something else. So I think for what it is, I think it did a good job. It's just, it took me a minute to really get into it and to appreciate it for what it is. I will not say that it's like my favorite. Yeah, I don't know if it's my cult classic, you know?
Yeah. And I guess another thing I'll like clarify is like, I was just like, I think it's also important, like, because they're kids, it's like their perpetuation is such a smaller scale of perpetuation than a lot of adults. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's also really important too. Like, it would be different if they were like murdering people and like ruling an oppressive country, doing messed up stuff.
They're a smaller reflection of a bigger issue. So this is just like a closer look at what is happening outside all the time.
Yeah,
because they are their parents and they are wealthy. So
so they're going to have influence one day. Yeah, I see.
Absolutely. I see. So yeah. So I think, like, you know, intimation, I think we get it now. I don't know if we, like, again, don't love it, but we do get it, and I do like, and people who cult classic love it. Absolutely, I get you doing that. I just, like, it wasn't made for me, and that's okay. And just like nothing of that time really was or would be. I don't think I'll ever, like, I don't have the nostalgia glasses for the 80s because I wasn't there, you know. My nostalgia glasses are like the aughts, you know, like late 90s when I was conscious of like what was happening around me and I could remember some of it. 80s not gonna be me. And I was not born in the wrong decade.
No. Me neither.
No, I don't want that much hairspray in my hair. I have mousse in my hair and it's so sticky. I hate it.
I don't think I could get that dressed up every day. Like, I remember getting dressed up in like middle and high school, like pretending, like, you know, trying.
Yeah, a blazer every day. No, thank you.
I don't think I could do it.
That's too much clothes.
Warm. Yeah.
I'm from Florida. We don't wear blazers. That's crazy. Anyway, cool. So that was this episode. We have another episode for Gen X next week, and then we're going to finally get to the millennials. We did it, y'all. We found them. We got two that we're going to cover. Some surprise, some not a surprise. It'll be fun. So stay tuned for our next episode in 2 weeks about Jawbreaker, which I'm very excited to see if it holds up to my nostalgia glasses.
Yeah.
If I put it on,
I never saw it, so I'm very excited to watch it.
Yikes. Like, we'll see. Yeah. So stay tuned to just see if you get that reaction from Gabe of being like, uh-oh. I liked this when it was on cable TV. There's a lot of those films where I watch back and I'm like, ugh. I was telling people this is my favorite movie. What? No. But excellent. So don't get married.
Let your kids, and hopefully if they do, your kids are like okay.
Yeah, your kids do not blow up the school for society. Don't do that, baby. Don't do that, baby. We're a fixed society.
Let's be nice to each other. And take care of each other. Build community. Grow gardens.
Yeah. The world is really dark and scary. And it gets increasingly that. It's so hot. It's so miserable. Nothing is doing what it was supposed to do. No. And it's scary. So let's all hold hands through the dark.
Let's all hold hands. That's what I want.
Okay.
Across America. I'm kidding. Okay. Bye.